Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way. This is a podcast for serious writers who want to develop their skills in artistry and stand out in a crowded industry by taking intelligent, creative risks. I'm your host, Jonathan Ball. I hold a PhD in literature. I'm the author of numerous books, and I take a very analytical approach to art making, emphasizing both efficiency and experimentation. So I'm here talking to Scott A. Ford, and I'll just, before I forget it, I want to say that his website is scottafordart.com.
Yes.
And Scott, is a writer and illustrator, and I don't know what else you might call yourself, a comic book creator.
Yeah. Graphic designer as well. Yeah.
Graphic designer, a colorist, I guess,
Yeah.
all sorts of different things. But his most recent book is a book called Arcaland, although he's got a number of other works we'll talk about. And his most recent project, I guess you'd say it would be, well, I know you've got some work in this great anthology, This Place, 150 Years Retold.
Yes.
And also online, again, at his website, scottafordart.com.
Yes.
You can see actually a lot of free material, which we'll kind of get into a little bit. But one of his most recent things is a serialized story in the Manitoban newspaper.
Yes.
And it's available also online at the Manitoban.com. It's actually Manitoban.com/category/Boreal.
Yeah.
But you can go to his website also, like I said, and click through to it. So there's a lot of his work that you can see online. I want to talk about some of the projects, some of the major sort of projects you've done, and a couple of like smaller ones over the course of your career so far.
Sure.
But let's just. And the specific thing I want to just note is like the reason I really want to talk to you is so this podcast is called Writing the Wrong Way, and it's my cutesy name, but like the sort of core idea of it is I'm really interested in writers. So I'm interested in your illustrative, your graphic work, but in some ways more as so far as it connects to storytelling. Like telling stories with these images and just connects to the writing aspects, but also like I'm really interested in writing that works or art stories that work in an unconventional way or have some like unconventional aspects. So the thing that initially got me interested in your work is actually your like second, I guess you say, big project, Giant Swell. So I actually just like maybe to start with that. Can you just like describe what Giant Swell is?
So Giant Swell is arguably my most experimental comic to date, which is a unfolded accordion book that sort of visually kind of looks like a 2D sprite-based video game that you read your way down, and the whole book unfolds over 20 feet long. Which is also available as a free webcomic on my site, just as a long scrolling image you just read your way down, which is not unconventional in a webcomic format, but a little less common in a giant 20-foot-long printed format. But I decided that I wanted to do something crazy and ambitious and take this webcomic idea and print it in a hardcover folded book.
Well, it's also interesting to me because, of course, as you say, it does, and you can see this online again if you go to scottafordart.com. You can see, you can scroll down the page and like read down this. Again, it's kind of almost like a video game-like descent into this well.
It starts at the top of this cold mountain, and it follows this little old man and his cat going down this well that turns into this strange, spooky cave, and as you read your way down, you slowly find out why he's going down this cave and sort of the history of this place.
But what's so great about it to me is that when you get the physical object, like this, paper book, accordion book, as you say, it's really, you kind of fold it out. It's 22 feet?
It's 22 feet,
22 foot, single panel comic.
Yes.
So if you actually take, this is something you can't really see well online because you're scrolling down. But if you get the physical object and just unfold it along the hall or something, you can see like it's a single image. When you're scrolling down the interwebs, you can't see the image at a glance like the way that you can if you unfold it all out. And it is an image like of this, which really gives this other dimension to the story.
Yeah, that was kind of the intent is not just playing with the format and taking this webcomic format and printing it, but there's a lot of very small details on the micro level, but then also on the macro level, you can see this greater image of what the shape of this chasm is, which is this sort of hollowed out remains of these giants so the name of the book, Giant's Well, it literally is a well from these ancient giants. That was one of the main reasons why I wanted to print it out, so that people could appreciate it, at a glance, but also at this very specific details. And there's little secrets here and there. You can see bats hanging from the caves, or I think there's a little treasure chest or some skulls hidden in little nooks and crannies of the chasm, just like Easter eggs in a video game. But yeah, it works on a couple of different levels. And the one thing that I do want to touch on before we move forward is you said that it's a single panel comic. But it's a single image comic, but the way that I always saw it was that the glow emanating from the old man's torch almost becomes the panel.
Well, that's what I wanted. The second thing I want to talk about, because again, on one hand, it is like a single image comic that, again, if you move away from it and you look at the whole thing at once.
Yes, it's like a map.
It's like a map. It has this. It's this sort of single picture, but at the same time, but then at that distance you can't read it.
Correct.
But once you get close to it, and as you say, you're just going down it, then you do have this sort of way in which, although it's one image, it actually is a story unfolding across time, and then every time you kind of like that man appears in these different lights and glows of this lamp.
Yeah.
So that was the sort of thing I'm just interested in on a writing level, is how did you come up with that really simple and smart solution to the problem of, I'd like to think of writing as a sort of, or storytelling even, whether you're using language or pictures or whatever. Like, I think a lot of storytelling is solving these creative problems. And I think one of the problems, quote unquote, with like the concept there is, how do you move through time in a one image?
As opposed to appearing like there's multiple versions of this character in a single landscape.
And usually paneling will like helps us do that. Like move from, even if you had a single image on a page, often conventionally what somebody would do is break it into like 5 panels to show these 5 time frames that happen on the same street, say. So you might have, like, that's a conventional way that'll work in a comic page, right? Is like you've got one image that they break into 6 panels, and then even though like the panels together constitute a single image, we understand like these time jumps are happening, and when the character shows up twice in the same sort of image, because it's 2 panels, we get like the time break. But you're doing a different thing. It's a similar concept in a way, but
it's almost reversed, and even reversed in the sense of the colors, because you normally think of panels as images on a white background, typically for comics, and this is images on a stark black background, and the glow, everything, within the cave is just pitch black, and the only details that you can see are where the old man is with his torch, or other light sources coming from other lanterns in the cave, and that's the only way you can see details in the world.
So how did you actually arrive at that idea? Like,
I'm trying to think.
As I move through the well, I'm going to solve the problem of how to shift from time to time in this way.
You know what? It was because I made it a few years ago. I'm trying to think how I arrived at that idea, and I might have seen other artists doing something similarly, or like I was saying, it's very video game inspired. That's not an uncommon feature in video games to have a segment where it's pitch black and your character needs to carry a torch to navigate this obstacle.
Sure, and then as like your torchlight goes, you get closer to an object, now you can see it's there.
Yes,
It
yeah.
almost is, it is a time reveal, and that it's like a story reveal in a sense.
Yeah, and so the trick here was pacing out the story so that the character not just progresses through this chasm, but progresses at a pace where the glow of his torch illuminates the path down, so that you can always trace where he's been. There's never a huge gap between one location and the next, where you can't really make out, wait, how did he get from that point in the cave to this point? You can trace through the glow, connecting the dots of, you can see a hint of a stairway here, and then you can kind of trace where that stairway would end up, which leads to a ladder, which you can vaguely see illuminated, and then that ladder clearly leads to this platform, etc. So it was kind of a puzzle in that sense of tracing out the pathway down this cave, and then placing the character through that environment and other light sources in a way that also paced out with the dialogue of the story, which I think was the trickiest part, was writing the script for the story. I think I drew the full map first, and then I wrote a script, and then I started placing that script into word balloons that then corresponded to the character placements.
So then, did you initially, when you came up with the idea for this, did you first have the idea of doing this, one big image, and then we're to move down it, or like what kind of came first in terms of the concept?
The format came first.
Sure.
I loved the idea, and the title came first. I can't remember where the title came from. Actually, I think it's inspired by Dante's Inferno. I think the last layer of hell, even underneath the ninth layer, is the
frozen lake where Satan's...
Yeah, and I think underneath
entombed.
that is the Giant's Well, which is the passageway back to the surface.
Yeah, that's right. He has to go... I can't remember precisely, but there's like a Cocytus is the name
Yes.
of this frozen lake that the monstrous, devilish creature... I forget precisely now, but he's frozen there and he has to go more or less underneath it.
Yeah, and so... But then deep underneath that...
Is the way out.
Is the way out, and so I like that idea of going deeper than the deepest part you think even goes, and also the idea of descending in order to emerge, as sort of a strange kind of flip-flop of ideas, or a paradox in that sense.
Well, it also has the Dantean idea of, he's going to save this woman in a weird sort of way. Like it's not exactly what he's doing in Inferno or even here, but there's that idea, like as he's going down the well in the comic, he's talking to this spirit, more or less.
Yes.
And as he's like telling, the spirit and him are kind of talking about the story of how the well came to be and so on. And as that's happening, you eventually get to sort of the reason why he keeps going down this well.
Yes.
Which has like a practical purpose, but also has this like more like emotional, reason that he's the one who keeps doing it, and this is why he's talking to the spirit and so on. It's really an interesting kind of way that so the story even just becomes about this guy is going, like, here's why I am going down the well.
Yeah, he basically has a job, and he lives at the top of the mountain, and he is the caretaker of the well, and so he routinely needs to descend the well in order to maintain it in a very physical, practical sense. And through that descent, you get the idea that he routinely encounters this spirit that he has a history with, but... and he has, grown old and she has not. And you get the sense that while he remembers, their history, she doesn't quite remember, given her state and given the history of how the well started and the other spirits in the well, that, yeah, she's sort of has this perpetual amnesia of their past that is that is hinted at every now and again by him returning to the well and ever so subtly reminding her of that past, and that's kind of the only thing that's keeping her from becoming one of the other more malicious spirits is him revisiting the well. Basically,
But you didn't have that idea first. That was something that came late.
So, yes, if we're backtracking a bit, I had an idea for the name and I had an idea for the format, and I tried a number of different concepts for the story before arriving at this one. One of them was more of a modern day, almost Goonies-esque scenario of these 5 kids exploring this spooky cave that gets weirder and weirder as they go down, and that was about as far as I got. And at that point, I was starting to try and draw the map of what that environment would look like and why they're going down there and what they find at the bottom, what the story arc would be through that descent, and it just wasn't coming together. Then I think where I arrived then is I thought that if this is going to be a single image, I want that image to represent something as a whole. In the same way, a story can represent something as a whole in a more literal context, and so that's when I had the idea to make the cave a large, discernible shape, just as a single object, as opposed to just a random cave-shaped blob, and so that's what led me down this path of a more sort of dark fantasy, abstract story with this giant skeletal-shaped cave.
Now, you also mentioned video games a few times. I think when I look at Arkland, I can also see the aesthetic of that.
And there are video games literally in Arkland as part of the story.
Yeah, they're playing video games. Plus, the aesthetic of it is very much looks like a video game. There's a lot of I don't know what you call them, pixel-esque. Imagery. Not that it's pixelated, but it has that kind of square edges on everything.
And I'm glad you noticed that, because that's very important to sort of the symbolism of the story. And the main character, Karen, in Arkland, plays video games in her everyday life, and that's part of her sort of routine, completely separate from the fantastical science fiction reality of their world. But in a way, it has this kind of symbolic connection of the sort of broad ramifications of how this fantasy and sci-fi world came to be.
So can you talk a bit about what is the world in Arkland and kind of how do video games fit into that in terms of you looking at coming up with that story?
Well, I mean, on a personal level, I love video games, and I am most, I create comics, but I feel like I'm most engaged in a story when I'm playing it in a game, and I'm slowly coming to terms with that, being more inspired by one medium, but dedicated to create in a different medium. And so I'm still coming to terms with that, but I love the idea of world building and exploration in a video game, and I think my ultimate goal in my overall career is to create a comic that feels that has that same sense of exploration and discovery as you do when playing a game, but through flipping through pages and uncovering that story through pages and noticing details in the artwork and in the storytelling.
Why not make a video game though? I'm not saying that you should, but I think it's an interesting question because I feel a similar way where I like to say that I want people to do things with my books, not just read them.
Yeah.
And my first book was a poetry book, but it's also a choose your own adventure book that you move from poetic statement. They all have numbers and you kind of hyperlink from one to the other, as opposed to reading the book in a normal fashion. And a lot of my books have that kind of weird aspect of which they're trying to ask you to engage physically with them or in some conceptual manner or something. My other second book, I did a book called Clockfire, which is all these instructions for plays that are impossible to produce. So they sort of demand that you imagine how they might be performed, And that's also, again, like I say, what drew me to Giantsville initially is this idea that it's a book that you have to get it and you have to fold it out. You have to find a space that you can fold out into. Like, I find like that sort of engagement is really interesting, and it does approximate the video game engagement on a level where you have to, like, you are moving the story forward in a very physical way.
Yes, and I think that's the key sort of difference between. Why don't I just make a video game? Is I love the physicality, and I love that tactile engagement with an object, and also as a standalone object. You know, this, if you equate a book, you know, moral, or a comic roughly to the same, you know, size and density of an iPad that you could put a game on, that device as an object has, like, you know, hundreds of other operations on it that you can easily flip between and get distracted by. But I still love that sort of romantic idea of a book just, you know, carrying this one purpose on its own. And that's what, you know, as if, you know, you were to buy like a video game console that just plays this one experience and that's it. I don't know why that intrigues me. It's just sort of that focus of an object, the same way that a story could focus on a particular topic or something like that.
In that serial comic,
video games are also just really hard. Let me just say that. And I think it's much easier to make a comic than make a video game. And I have not studied video game development, you know, in a specific, you know, tangible way. And I think to tell these same stories that I'm telling in a video game that would meet expectations and be fun to play would be extremely hard and very expensive and take a lot more time than I'm already making. And so I can almost explore these ideas faster and more accurately through this medium.
Oh, no, there's no almost.
You
can. Right?
Yeah, no,
like,
true.
Sometimes students will come up to me and they'll say, like, I've got this great idea. I don't know if it should be a screenplay, like a movie, or if it should be like a graphic novel. And I'm like, well, do you have $1 million?
Yeah.
Like, if you can write one of these two scripts, if you could theoretically write both, but like, if you can only write one, like, graphic novel is not necessarily cheap to do, but it's not going to cost you $5 million.
Yeah.
You know,
and $5 million, that's a pretty cheap movie.
Yeah, that's the thing. Especially if you're in sci-fi land, right, or something like like this. You know, you got Game of Thrones style storytelling or whatever. I mean, all the mediums are different, but what I think is really interesting. This is the other thing that kind of is interesting about your work, and why I notice all these video game connections is, again, like, I'm really interested in media that takes other media aspects and pulls them in. And so even in Boreal, that kind of serialized like weekly comic you were doing, you've got this structure, the story structure where the main character keeps dying and coming back, like just like in a video game. You know,
and I think that original concept was a weird pipe dream I had for a simple video game that I ended up mashing together with another story idea I had, and that's what I came up with for this weekly comic. Was sort of, that's how I come up with a lot of ideas, is I have an ongoing list of ideas, and then sometimes I try to mash them together and it makes something more interesting than they are on their own, which sounds kind of just random and haphazard, but I guess that's how I operate.
But that's a good way to work. Like, I do that too. Grigory Komichik, that we both know, does that too. You know, he's always got these massive notebooks, and Greg has this great saying he stole from somebody, I'm sure, like, you know, don't delete, transmute, or something along those lines. The idea of, like, you just, you know, you file everything away and then you pull it out when you need it. And I find that it's so, anytime I'm stuck, you know, I just will go, like, through my, like, little list of ideas, and it's like, okay, well, what can the characters do in this scene? I don't know. I remember thinking that it would be interesting if somebody took Count Chocula cereal and poured orange juice in. I wonder what that would taste like. And so, like, maybe one guy can be doing that. Well, but maybe one guy can be, like, doing that, and the other character's, like, trying to talk to them about something serious while they're doing that, and then now they've got something to react to and discuss. Like, there's all sorts of ways which you can just use that random recombination. And sometimes it doesn't work. But, but often, like, it gives you these weird, interesting, odd ideas. And, like, with Boreal, I think is just I want to come back to Arkland in a little bit, but with Boreal, I think of one, you've got the kind of video game idea of like this respawning character. Two, you've got the jackalope.
Yes.
Like this,
Jackalope, well, it's kind of a combination of the jackalope, the Wolpertinger, which is an older jackalope-esque mythological creature, which basically looks the same, but it has wings, and also the puka, which is a shape-shifting, I think it's an Irish folktale beast that sometimes takes the form of a rabbit, sometimes a horse, or I think even sometimes a monkey, as sort of a trickster character. Yes, yeah.
And then also, of course, it's a weekly comic. It tends to be like a serialized story. You've got you've got this very long kind of series of panels that go very far down the page.
Yeah.
Or like online, you scroll down these panelings. So and sometimes you'll split that up in a way that suggests. There's a couple issues where you split it up where like this underworld. Is like at the bottom of the page, and the kind of the above. You've got a couple moments where you like match two panels, one above the other, and like the one is like almost the reverse of the other, the underworld.
Yeah, that was a very specific scene where you see the fern, the green fern on sort of the top side, the world of the living, and then the red fern coming down underneath in the land of the dead or the underworld or what have you.
So you seem to think a lot about page composition in terms, not just in terms of storytelling, but also as an object, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, and that's not even something I typically think too closely about. That's something I find more sort of intuitive. Like I was saying, I think about the physicality of these spaces, and not just within the panel, but outside the panel, and the physicality of how the panels interact. I mean, that's just sort of good comic. Layout design is not just paying attention to each image, but paying attention to how they relate to the other images on the page, and how your eye, goes from one to the other.
Do you find in writing though, like when you're trying to tell a story, like are you thinking through that sort of image setup first, in a manner of speaking? Are you thinking through the story and like how am I going to lay out this story? Like what's your actual writing process? I guess is the question.
It's actually fairly binary. I take one of two approaches. If I feel like it is a more action heavy or image heavy sequence, I will plan out those images first, and then go back and see what necessary dialogue needs to be a part of this sequence for story reasons or clarity or what have you, and then fit those into the image layout I've already planned. Or option B is I know already this is going to be a very story heavy sequence. The story is moving forward through a conversation, or an inner monologue or something like that, and so then I will write a script first, parcel that script once it's all edited and I feel like it's solid enough, parcel that script into word balloons, and then fit those word balloons onto a page and then arrange the panels around those word balloons. Because I often think of word balloons as a form of punctuation. I will plan out dialogue, thinking of with the word balloon in mind, the difference between a standalone word balloon, with text in it, or two connected word balloons, or two word balloons connected by sort of a long, connector arrow or whatever it's called. Branch between the two almost becomes like a pause, or can have room for another character's dialogue in between that. At the same time, maybe I've got a statement that is very few words, but I want to put that in a big empty word balloon just to punctuate that that statement as something larger, even though the words are very few. And then once I have that, that takes up physical space on a page, then I can determine how much of this I can fit on a page, how many panels I need to fit all this dialogue, and if I need to make any cuts, if I need to, trim down this dialogue, or if I've got room to maybe add something extra that I left out.
So what I'm kind of trying to figure out it's just really interesting.
It's a very physical kind of, collage kind of approach.
I think it sounds like Giant's Well is maybe a bit of an unusual one for you in the sense of like it sounds like you had the idea of this well and going down the well, and then you're sort of in the after you've got like the formal idea and you're fleshing the formal idea out. Now you're starting to come up with different story ideas and how the story idea might move in that space. Whereas it sounds like, so for something like Arkland, then, are you starting with any sort of like story in the sense of like, are you planning out story beats? Are you outlining a thing before you start drawing? Or is it, like, where does this sort of idea start with in terms of... like, are you drawing first? Are you writing? Are you doing some weird combination? Like, are you outlining? It sounds like you're outlining the story in some form, and then you're kind of breaking into sequences. And then you're kind of going sequence by sequence, whether you're writing or drawing first, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. So Arkland is chapter-based, and each chapter has a key location. And so that was my starting point, is I had the general note of, I sort of work my way down. Is like, okay... First step was I wanted to make a science fiction fantasy book that is about a fantasy world sort of turned on its head by the arrival of alien creatures and alien technology. That's my premise. And then from there, okay, what is the plot going to be from there? And that's where I came up with the idea for the contest that sort of spurs the main story arc forward. And then from there, I decided I wanted it to be a journey-based story, and then I decided what locations I want to have, and thinking on a more visual level of what locations would be fun and interesting and have diversity to mix up the story. And so that's where I came up with, okay, I want sort of this vast moors with a lone hut on it, just thinking of that stark imagery as something visually interesting. The idea of the town, the forest, the sewers, the mountain as just sort of very general locations. Locations I had never worked with before in a comic that, again, inspired by video games and other illustrators and comics. I'm just intrigued to place a narrative in those places.
Almost like levels in a game. Like
very
here's
level
the level,
based.
here's the dungeon, here's the forest.
So of course I needed a sewer level and a forest level. That's very video game inspired for sure. And it winks at the reader in a way, using those. And then from there I just started arranging those locations like big tiles on a timeline, deciding where the character has this objective and they need to get here, and this is, where they end up and where they make choices. And so deciding where those choices take place and arranging those locations based on that timeline. I just sort of operate within these large chunks of these are things I'd like to have, and these are the things that should happen, and how can I fit those together? Or what happens if... what happens in the main sort of turning point in this location? What if I swap that turning point for this other location? How does that play out differently? How do the characters move through that space differently? And how that location might connect to the next one? Does that make sense in a literal way, in a practical way? Does that seem appealing narratively? I sort of run through the gamut of options and just try to pick the one that I think seems best.
It sounds like you're mapping. So you're really mapping out, in many ways, this broad strokes story.
Yes.
I don't know what you would be putting together as a document or anything, but it sounds like you're basically
in this case, it was
outlining.
Post-it notes on a wall.
Really?
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
And that's your outline in a manner of speaking.
Yeah.
Screenwriters will often use like cue cards stuck to a corkboard and stuff. And
same thing.
So that's sort of, you're getting the structure figured out, in other words.
Yeah. And
outlining the story, getting all the core like chapters, in this case I guess, down, or like big story sequences. And then but you're not really drawing at this point, or are you just sketching ideas?
This was, I mean, I'm sure I was sketching on the side, but it wasn't really connected to this narrative Post-it note process. And then once I knew the locations that I wanted, and I nailed down, basically I was confident enough in how I had arranged these Post-it notes through locations and through the plot, then I started more seriously drawing and started with concept art. Started planning out, doing concept art for all these key locations that these chapters take place in.
So how long does that kind of process take? I guess the kind of question I'm kind of wondering here is, in this part is, I find the process really interesting to get to, because I'm always telling people, you guys should do a lot of work before you get to first draft. Oh, I see. So Scott just handed me a bunch of his concept actual art.
Yes.
That you can buy prints of. I don't know if can you find these things through your website, or do you have to find your show?
My print store is still under construction. So
okay, well, he's building a print store.
But you can find me at a variety of festivals in Winnipeg and across Canada.
Are you going to? There's an upcoming festival. Are you going?
FanQuest.
FanQuest.
Yes, I will.
Yeah. So Scott will be at FanQuest if you're hearing this early enough and you're in Winnipeg. But so he's got like days in the moors, night in the moors, day in the town, night in the town, forest day, and these all sort of, you can get, like, these are all prints you have, of course, but these are also like concepts for the spaces, the locations, as you say.
Yeah, and I drew these as tools for myself. You know, I just felt the need to draw these. I wasn't thinking like, oh, I'm going to make concept art and then I can sell that. That wasn't my process. I felt the need to plan these out, and then after the fact I realized, oh, maybe people actually want to buy these. And so those early concept arts, you can see the moors day and night, the town day and night. That was just a way of me trying to plan out those locations and coloring based on time of day. Using the same ink, so I inked a location, and then I just colored it differently in Photoshop, so it's the same outlines, just different coloring, and that gave me a blueprint of the type of environment that it is, and how characters could act in those spaces. The general vibes of those locations, you know, depending upon the time of day, and things like that.
It's really interesting to. I think like the analogy or the analogous thing in like writing prose fiction might be, you know, or even a screenplay or something, might be figuring out like what's the setting and what are people doing in the setting. One of the things that I think is a useful test in editing that I advise people to do is like, when you're looking at your first draft of a story, say, you know, and thinking through like, could this just happen in another setting?
Yeah.
And if it could, probably there's a problem with your setting.
Yeah.
You know, like ideally characters should be interacting with the setting. You know, it should matter where they are. Like it should matter whether they're in a forest or a sewer. Right?
Yeah.
You know, and it should matter whether they're on a boat or in the sky, opposed.
And sometimes those are just. I mean, this is me just speaking personally, but I feel like those can just be symbolic reasons of the difference between this location and another. Yes, the events could physically unfold the same way, but it wouldn't feel the same, and it wouldn't have the same sort of general vibes. And I think that's an important thing, especially in a visual medium like comics.
Well, even just the tone is going to shift potentially. Like the tone might be all you're after with, you know, this setting or that setting.
Yeah.
But as I say, like it could be a symbolic reason. It could just be a plot thing where, like it really matters they're here now, and then later we're going to come back there. Like that's a common. That's a common thing you'll see in movies a lot. Is, you know, the characters or the location at the start that gets established, people come back to. You know, those same characters are there in some form. So
and
there's no rules about it.
In Arkland, for sure, is the starts in the moors and, you know, journeys forward and returns to the moors, and almost gives you that sort of false ending. You know, if you were watching this as a film, you might not know how much time has elapsed, and you're almost questioning, oh, is this the end? Is everything wrapping up? And then the twist happens of like, oh no, this is something new and bigger happens and sparks the sort of third act of the story.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think through, like, again, in thinking through like story sequences, to think through like, okay, well, where are these things happening and so on. It's very much I think the way like a screenwriter would work in some respects, but also, of course, like in comics, it really makes sense to be thinking through, like, you don't want, like, depending on what kind of story you're telling or what kind of, I guess, like tone or vibe you want. Especially if you're thinking like you want that video game, even if you're not thinking, but if you're just influenced by like the video game idea of like these sharp demarcations between like level 1 and level 2, and like all the different ways, like when Link walks into a dungeon, it's there's a whole different set of things that a different button does a different thing now. Like there's all sorts of different ways in which the environments in games, especially, like they make so much difference in narratively. And even your controls in a game will sometimes shift, and like everything's different in certain types of environments. And I think that it's an interesting way to think through story in terms of like, okay, well, what are the different options here where a character could do this or could do that? Like when they're in the bar, for example, like at that one part where you have them playing a video game, like it's, she's like playing these little games at home, and then there's like this, of course the bar would have an arcade game, and then like,
it looks nicer than hers at home, which seems very cobbled together.
And it's like it's another reason for her to go to this bar. Like there's different plot reasons, but it's like piggybacking onto like the plot reasons she might be there. There's like this almost like this character or emotional reason, I guess you'd say, that she's there. And then that starts to kind of play into that. Well, that's, I think, ideally, I think that makes like the reader kind of notice the look of the comic they've been reading compared to like how these like video games look. And like I think there's interesting like ways in which you can kind of ladder together these or ladder up these like little like this meta, I guess, effects.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there are certainly video games that look like Arkland in an illustrated way, but then within Arkland you have that sort of deeper zooming in of even more retro and more simplified games. So in a sense, it almost feels like a game within a game, and Arkland as a whole being kind of structured like a video game and almost level based in its chapters. But then you take that very microscopic pixelated level of those video games that you can compare all the way up to the highest level, which is these alien arcs, which high up in the sky just kind of look like pixels. And so it's almost, that was my initial sort of metaphor structure of relating the macro to the micro, relating something extremely mundane and everyday and almost an impractical pastime, relating that to something religious and something that gives a whole group of people purpose. And
the ritual aspect of just the repeatability, and like they're always going and doing these same sorts of things, and what does it really mean or matter beyond maybe what it like on this grander scale. One of the things I think, so how long does it take to do something like that? Like what's your process in terms of like, so with Arkland, for example, just as Arkland as an example, because it's probably the most, if you were just like glance at it on a table, it's probably the most conventional object. Like it's one book, it's self-contained, it's front to back, the story doesn't
reads pretty linearly.
And it's got other things that are kind of more unusual in it, but at a glance it's like a normal book. And so like what's the timeline of that, working on something like that?
Well, I started planning it, talking about concept art and plot writing. I started it in 2014, and it, for a frame of reference, it released in spring of 2018. But most of that time was planning and, somewhat dragging my heels and working on other things and finishing school and stuff like that. But the majority of the book itself, what you actually see in the printed book, I produced in 2017, basically working from January. Well, maybe about like 13, 14 months straight working from, late 2016 to early 2018. 2017 was my year of working on Arkland. That's basically all I did, just nonstop, was working on this book. Well,
after you'd already planned everything.
Yes.
It.
So that was
and you'd sold it by that point then?
Sorry?
You'd sold it by that point as well?
Yes, and that was the main reason why I was working on it nonstop and not dragging my heels as much, because I had a publishing contract that I needed to honor and was trying to finish in as timely a fashion as I could, which turned out to be not as timely as I or they would have liked, but here we are. It's finished and people like it. So
it's a miracle, those deadlines. I just got a grant to finish a book, and I started working on this book in like 2005, and so I'm talking, but I'm putting this grant together, and somebody was asking me, they're like, well, how long are you gonna need to finish this book? I'm like, oh, it'll be done in like less than a year.
Oh, sure.
But they're like, well, you've been working on this thing for like 14 years. I'm like, well, working on it is a real loose phrase.
Yeah, for sure.
When you don't have a deadline on it, yeah, you're working on it.
Yeah.
But,
And that's what Arkland was from 2014 till, mid 2016 was sort of a just slow sort of chipping away at it kind of process, and also just sort of sitting on it. I call it wheel spinning, when you just sort of let something stew and you let your the cogs in your brain aren't engaging with each other. They're just spinning and not producing anything. And I feel like that's part of the process, and I've come to terms with that. So many of my new ideas, I'm just trying to beat my head against that wall, trying to bust through this plot hole or figure out this story arc or trying to develop this character, and sometimes you just got to let those wheels spin, and that what feels like doing nothing is letting your brain rest, or I feel like is letting my brain rest, and eventually through that sort of that process of what feels like nothing, you end up finding your answers.
But it's not nothing. I mean, you're doing other things.
Correct.
Right? But how is it different if you're working on something like a serialized? So you've done these two little serialized projects.
Yes.
One is I was holding and looking at a little
Okasamoso.
flip book called
Okasamoso.
So, and that's also available online. It was published in the Uniter. We're on the University of Winnipeg's campus here, and so it was originally published in the University of Winnipeg's newspaper, the Uniter, and is also again online at scottafordart.com.
Yes,
you can read the whole thing there. And then Boreal, like I say, it was publishing recently in Manitoban, which you can also read, online.
Yeah, so I've done two very different weekly comics, one for the University of Winnipeg student newspaper, and more recently one Boreal for the University of Manitoba student newspaper.
There you have like a weekly deadline. Like, are you doing the whole thing and then like approaching them, or are you working week by week on this?
So, well, they both came out of very different reasons. Okasamoso came at a time when I was working at the Uniter as the design editor, I think was the title of my position, basically doing layout and graphics for the Uniter newspaper every week. That was my job. And part of that position was filling the comics section, which we did not have enough contributors for at the time. So I felt like, well, I guess it's part of my job to fill this, and there's no one to fill it, so I guess I'll make a weekly comic. So I did, which turned into a bi-weekly comic because, I ran out of time, and we had, some contributors to fill in the weeks between. So that was kind of born out of necessity, but basically I just tapped into one of my many, ideas, sitting on my back burner, and this one was, I want to try making a comic that combines photography and illustration, that tells the story of this, tiny little spaceman who's making off-base observations about the world, and that's about it, and it's mostly silly.
It's actually not that silly, though. It's
I'm
a
glad
very
you think
mournful,
so.
sad little
It
story.
is.
Like, the world there's no hope for this world. Well, but maybe there is. He'll go back, and he can't quite give it up. It's got like a very poignant little, by the time you get to the end anyway, it's got a very poignant little ending.
Yeah,
It's only 12 issues / 12, like each comic is 4 panels.
4-panel
It's
strip,
pretty
yeah.
conventional in some respects. 4-panel strip, but it is like this serialized little story, and it has an interesting set of turns every now, and then it ends with this very kind of.
It does come across a little melancholy in the
Mm-hmm.
end, which I like. I think that's my favorite mood to tell a story in.
It's very different from, say, like, taking years to
Yes.
ruminate and plan.
And so more recently, Boreal, which was published in the Manitoban Student newspaper, that was a paid position at the Manitoban, just producing that weekly comic, which was, I believe, is a brand new position. I don't believe they've ever hired staff before just to produce a comic, not as part of another job. And they approached me actually after doing Okasamoso in the Uniter, and they had seen my work with Arkland because I'm friends with a number of staff there, so they were familiar with my work and that I knew how to produce competent comics, and so they were trying to open up this position, and they felt like I would be the right person to test that through. So they approached me. They said, we're starting this new position, and they basically let me do whatever. And I came up with this idea for Boreal first, and I had a meeting with them just to make sure that this sounded okay and that it was going to physically fit in the paper, how much space I had and how much story I could tell in that real estate on the page. And then from there, I was basically producing it a week at a time, but I had a full story arc planned for all 26 issues of the Manitoban, which coincided into 26 strips of Boreal. So I had a full story arc and a beat by beat what I think would happen in each 26 segment. But yeah, basically working, a week at a time.
Had you always worked that way? Like, your first real comics, I guess you'd say, would be Romulus and Remus.
Yes.
You did, which, are kind of in 2 issues, although they look like they're basically 2 different graphic novels. They're different lengths and everything.
Yes, yeah.
And this is so you had done this in high school, more or less.
End of high school.
End of high school.
I came up with the idea for Romulus and Remus in the summer after high school, and then immediately after that, I was starting first year university at the University of Manitoba, going through fine arts, and at that point, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just starting university. I didn't know what my artistic career was going to be. I didn't know how to make comics at that point, and I hadn't really explored that many comics either. So it was just a weird little hobby idea I had of making this action horror comic that, for all I knew at that point, it could have turned into, nothing, that was just a fun experiment and I don't even show anyone. But what it turned into, after 3 years of slowly chipping away at it, I produced a 34-page, action horror comic that I printed and I self-published and sold, and a lot of people have read and enjoyed and have asked me to continue the series, which I still haven't decided if I will.
So is that sort of your way of trying to teach yourself how to do comics? Was that kind of the impetus of it?
Basically. I guess I'm not much for practice. I just like making it up as I go along, and I figure I'd rather make something and have something to show for it and still call it practice rather than just sort of toiling away at something that is not a finished product. I don't know, that I might find more discouraging through that process because, you almost don't have anything to show for it.
But you don't have stakes, right? Like, I suggest this too, and I think the same way, because I remember years and years ago I made a short film, and the reason I did it was I was taking a class at the Winnipeg Film Group, and it was a class on like how do you hand process Super 8 and 60mm film. So it was like you get best in black and white film, you like put it in a bucket, like here's how you do it. So I paid $50 or whatever to take this class. And so you had to shoot a bunch of film and then process it in a bucket. And I, and the way I approached it was I'll come up with a silent film comedy script and I'll shoot that. And then when I process it, it'll look like, oh, this is like a silent Chaplin comedy that like nobody bothered to preserve. So it's fine for me to screw it up and whatever. But it was still like you're just supposed to shoot a test of anything. Right. I ended up shooting a whole thing and I developed it and it turned out well. You didn't
have to go through all that trouble.
And I sold it to the Comedy Network.
Oh, wow.
And like it was the kind of thing where like I kind of lucked out in some ways because I just happened that like I didn't do it myself. Like somebody else like at the Winnipeg Film Group where I was taking the workshop, like when it was done, like they liked it enough to like throw it in this batch of things and and then this place bought it. But it was precisely for that same sort of thing. I was just thinking like, well, what's going to get me through this and like keep my interest in it and so on is like I have to have some sort of, it has to feel like it has stakes to me.
Yeah.
Like I'm doing it for real. Otherwise it's too easy to just quit once something else catches your eye or whatever.
Yeah, and
you don't learn if you quit things all the time.
And you get to sort of a point where you're not really sure if you're ready, if you're just practicing at making something, you go down that rabbit hole of like, okay, when do I actually start making the thing, as opposed to practicing through making the thing. I think you learn a lot more through that process because you're doing everything and you're finding things that you didn't know were part of the process that you might struggle with or that you might even like, and then you'll find new vocations through that. Like learning, layout and graphic design and the whole printing process, was really fascinating, and that's not something I would have learned unless I had, self-published a comic.
And even if it was an abject failure, you would have learned that and gone, then like becoming a graphic designer or whatever, like like again, doing it for real sort of gives you that. You get the insight into like how people really do it, which is always to me fascinating because it's always like something you don't expect. It's like when I first started talking to comics with comic creators like you and and other people I know. One of the things that I really had never thought about was like, oh, if you're writing a comic, you have to think about when people turn the page.
Oh yeah,
like it's such a basic, simple thing that probably to you, but like I never considered it because of course it's just not how you don't think about that when you're reading a book.
Yeah. Or people think about a comic page as a standalone object, when in reality, no, you have to think of 2 pages, and the difference between what's on the left side and what's on the right side is huge. It's not just in terms of the page turn surprise, which is a big part of that page by page storytelling, but just what you're observing, on the left side and the right side and how that transitions. And when you turn that page, you're going to see the right side before you see the left side. And so if you put, something dramatic, way at the end of that far right page, you're going to see that coming before you've even read the left page. And so you're pacing it out that way, and how your eye moves down that page and then onto the next page. There's a lot of layout and sort of just general sort of artistic composition elements that you need to keep in mind that keep you reading in a logical way, and you don't confuse your reader. I think that's a big thing, is as soon as your reader gets even a little bit lost, you're going to risk them just putting it down and saying like, oh, I'll come back to that later, and probably they won't. You need to keep them engaged and keep them feeling like they understand how they're reading this and how they're progressing through it.
Yeah, and if you're doing it, if you're drawing page by page, and you're not doing it for real.
Yeah.
Well, now you don't have to start putting the pages together and think and bind them and lay them out and send them to the printer or whatever. Like you don't have to think about that second step. Maybe you might have like academically thought about it. But if you're not doing it, like you don't really know.
Oh yeah, the idea of thinking about doing something versus actually doing it are miles apart. But the other thing though is about my process is coming from. I was going through fine arts while I was working on Romulus and Remus issue 1, and through those classes, you don't have a lot of time to practice. You're just moving from one project to another, from one class critique to another, and that's how those classes operate. Is you're learning as you go, but you don't have time to just make work for practice sake. You're always making work for a finished product on tight deadlines, and so I came at it with that approach too. Is that I just need to learn while I'm making it, and I don't have the same deadline as school, but thinking about it as a finished art product, but also thinking of it as an art product rather than a piece of literature or something that I need to pitch to someone and see if I get publishers interested. That wasn't a concept to me. I was thinking of this as an art piece. If you're gonna make a painting or a sculpture, you just do it. I mean, yes, you could apply for grants or something like that to fund it, but in practice, you're the artist, you create it. And so I didn't think of this as a publishing project. I just thought of it as an art project that has writing in it. And happens to take the form of a book. And so if I wanted that to see the light of day, I just need to figure out a way to make that myself.
Every time I apply for a grant, I say in the grant, I'll do this project by such, this project will take me this many, this long. But if I get the grant, it'll only take me this long.
Yeah.
Because I want to indicate I'm not just I'm going to do this stuff. It's just that it would really help if I could focus on it and I could get it done faster, and it would help my career. It would help it would just help the project because I don't have to splinter into doing all these other things. And it helps to have that deadline, I think, too. You got to file a report by this date, or you got to submit to the publisher by this date. I think Gregory once said to me, if I remember right, he once told me when he really needs to buckle down and work, he'll just call the printer and set a date to him. He has to deliver the file to the printer. He's he'll pay them some money, and then he'll and he's well, now I'm stuck. I got to be done.
Yeah, which can be good or bad.
It can be good or bad.
That works for some people, but.
It works for Greg, but I mean, I could see it not working. If you don't know what you're doing, it's different if you know what you're doing and you know how fast you can work. Sometimes you don't know that. When you're starting out, you don't know how fast you can work. You don't know what you can do in a day.
Like Arcland, for instance, was a huge project, and like I said, I was taking a long time just planning it, and I was really happy when I got that publishing deal. Obviously because it's a publishing deal, and that was incredible. But also just because now I had a deadline. That now I wasn't just making this for myself. That somebody else was waiting for this, and I owed someone else this product in a timely fashion. But even with that, I took a lot longer than they wanted and than I wanted, and so that was a huge learning process of. A deadline isn't everything. That even when I have that fire, burning that is telling me that this has to be done by a certain date, there's that perfectionist in me that still takes over and doesn't finish it until I feel like it's actually finished. So that was a really interesting learning process. Learning, the difference between deadlines and my own personal goals. And how to mitigate the two.
Well, and also if you're doing a project like that's longer, literally longer than you've done before.
Going from a 54-page book, with Romulus and Remus issue 2 to a 260-page book, that was immense. That was, I think the point where I reached the 60-page mark in Arcland. And I realized this is the equivalent of making all of Romulus and Remus issue 2, which is the longest thing I've ever done. So at that point, and I'm still not even halfway through this thing, was in a way, I found it funny that the final chapter in Arcland and the final objective is this character ascending this mountain because it really felt like that. Is like I'm marching steadily towards this huge task, this huge obstacle, and like one way or another I'm gonna get to the top of that thing. And yeah, it was, it was, I guess if I'm gonna keep riding this mountain metaphor, it was a lot of work, and it was very tiring and very stressful, but being at the top of it feels pretty good. And yeah, but it took a lot to get here.
Well, thanks so much for talking to me. And again, that's scottafordart.com, where
Yes.
you can find more information about Scott's books and other projects, but also, actually read some of them. Although even the ones you read, like I say, like if you can read all the Giants well online, but it's a whole different thing to have that object in your hand and to be able to like look at it all at once and unfold it and so on. So I really encourage people to get some of Scott's books, but you can read quite a lot of his work online. So thanks again for talking to me, and everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great, and everyone listening. Again, check out writingthewrongway.com, scottafordart.com, and keep writing the wrong way.